The Johnson family had been looking forward to this vacation for months. Marcus Johnson, a quiet and reserved FBI agent, had worked long hours in the city, often dealing with high-stakes cases that drained him both physically and emotionally. He had always promised Naomi, his wife, that they would take some time off together away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. This year, they were determined to make it happen. Naomi, a loving and strong woman, had prepared everything: the bags, the itinerary, and the snacks for the long drive. Their 2 children, little Tasha and Jamal, were excited, their innocent laughter filling the car as they headed out on the open road. The destination was a small, picturesque town nestled in the mountains, a place far removed from the bustle of the city. It was supposed to be the perfect retreat for the family to relax, to enjoy the beauty of nature, and to spend quality time together without distractions. Marcus had imagined the peaceful moments they would share, sitting on the porch of a cozy cabin reading books, walking through lush green forests, and watching the sunset over the distant hills. It was supposed to be a break from the demanding world he had left behind. As they drove further away from the city, the landscape shifted from urban sprawl to the calm, rolling hills of the countryside. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a golden hue over the winding road ahead. The children were quiet now, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Naomi sat beside Marcus, her hand resting on his knee, a gentle smile on her face. It had been a long time since they had the luxury of a quiet moment like this, and Marcus cherished it. The weight of his job, the constant pressure, seemed to fade as they moved further away from the city. But as they neared their destination, something unexpected happened. A patrol car appeared behind them, its siren blaring loudly. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, confused. The road was empty, and there was no apparent reason for the sudden attention. He slowed the car, moving over to the side of the road, instinctively knowing this wasn't going to be a routine stop. Naomi, sensing the change in his demeanor, turned to him with concern in her eyes. Marcus kept his focus straight ahead, trying to keep his composure. He knew that he had to stay calm, that this could easily be just a simple check, nothing more. But something in his gut told him otherwise. The patrol car pulled up behind them and 2 officers emerged. Both were tall, one with dark hair and the other with blonde, wearing dark uniforms that made them look intimidating. The first officer approached the driver's side window, tapping on the glass. Marcus lowered it slowly, his eyes meeting the officer's with a calm expression, though his mind was racing. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his tone not exactly warm. "Can I see your license and registration?" "Of course," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even, his hands moving to the glove compartment. He handed the documents to the officer, trying to ignore the tension that was building in his chest. Naomi looked out the window, her eyes scanning the scene as the second officer stood near the rear of the car watching them. The first officer took a long look at Marcus, then at Naomi, then back at Marcus again. There was a moment of silence, the kind that felt unnervingly long. "You all just passing through?" the officer asked, his tone more accusatory now. "Yes, just headed up to the cabin for a vacation," Marcus replied. He tried to keep his voice steady, but there was an underlying tension he couldn't hide. He could sense that the officer was scrutinizing him, sizing him up, looking for something. "Vacation, huh?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "Where exactly are you going?" "We're headed to Pine Hollow," Marcus said, trying to keep his answer as nonchalant as possible. It wasn't far from here, just a quiet little town where they could relax for a few days. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Never heard of it." He glanced over at his partner, who had been silent up to this point. The second officer was staring at the family through the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering on Naomi and the children. "What's your business up there?" The first officer pressed, his voice suddenly more aggressive. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "We're just going to relax. It's a family trip," he said, trying to de-escalate the situation. The officer wasn't buying it. "Family trip, huh? Well, you don't look like the usual kind of people we get around here." His voice had taken on a tone of suspicion. Naomi tensed beside Marcus, and he could see her hands tighten around the edges of her seat. The tension in the air was thick now, and Marcus knew that this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop anymore. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his line of work, and he could sense when things were about to take a turn for the worse. The officer paused for a moment, his eyes scanning Marcus again. "You don't look like you belong here," he said almost under his breath, but Marcus could hear it clearly. He had heard the underlying message, the officer's bias, the subtle but unmistakable judgment. "We're just here to relax," Marcus repeated, his voice tighter now. Naomi was looking at him, her eyes wide with concern, but Marcus didn't want her to worry. He needed to handle this. The officer took a step back and motioned for his partner to come forward. The second officer approached the window with a cocky swagger. Marcus could see the way the officers were standing, the way they were moving. It wasn't just about a simple check anymore. There was something else going on here. They were treating him like a suspect, as though they had already decided something about him before he even spoke. Naomi looked at Marcus, her face pale, and Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. He could feel it too, deep in his chest, but he had to stay calm. He had to think clearly. He wasn't just any man on the side of the road. He was Marcus Johnson, an FBI agent, but he couldn't show that just yet, not until he knew what these officers were really after. And so, the tension continued to build as the officers circled them, unaware of the truth they were about to uncover. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of it heavy on Marcus's chest. The officer, still standing at the side of the car, continued to study him like a suspect. It felt as if every movement, every breath Marcus took was being dissected and judged. Naomi sat beside him, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of her seat. The children, sensing the discomfort of their parents, had gone silent, their wide eyes glancing between their mother and father, unsure of what was happening. The officer finally stepped back and exchanged a look with his partner, who stood by the rear of the car, arms crossed. Their body language was unmistakable, clearly not at ease, and Marcus knew that they had made their minds up about him. The first officer, still standing by the driver's side window, leaned in slightly, his voice low but hard. "We don't usually get people like you in these parts," he said, his words heavy with an underlying threat. Marcus could feel the officer's gaze on him, sizing him up as though he were a criminal already. It wasn't just about the family being black. There was something more insidious lurking beneath the officer's words, something that Marcus had seen too many times before. The quiet racism that shaped every interaction, every decision, no matter how subtle. Marcus tried to keep his cool, his hand resting on the steering wheel, fingers digging into the leather. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of annoyance creeping in. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he knew it was important to stay composed. If he lost control now, it would only escalate things further. The officer ignored the question and instead took a step back, turning his attention to the family in the car. "Your kids look like they're scared. You're not causing trouble, are you?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion, as if he was expecting them to be some kind of threat. Naomi's face flushed with frustration, but she held her tongue, not wanting to provoke the officer further. She turned to Marcus, her eyes pleading for him to do something, anything to make this stop. But Marcus knew that there wasn't much he could do at this moment. He had to figure out how to turn this situation around, but the longer this dragged on, the harder it would be to avoid conflict. He glanced at the officer's partner, who had yet to speak. The second officer was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed, a scowl etched on his face. There was something about the way he looked at Marcus that unsettled him, like he was itching for a reason to escalate things. Marcus didn't know if the officer was just following his partner's lead, or if he had his own biases to work through, but either way, it was clear that this wasn't just a routine stop. The first officer, sensing the growing tension, took a deep breath and moved to the back of the car. His partner stepped forward, now directly next to the window, and asked, "You got any weapons or drugs in here?" His voice was direct, and the accusation was thinly veiled, as though Marcus had already been presumed guilty of something. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "No, we don't have anything like that," he said firmly. He was beginning to feel a simmering anger rise inside him. This was ridiculous. The family was just on vacation, but here they were, being treated like criminals. It wasn't just frustrating, it was dehumanizing. He tried to remind himself to stay calm, to keep his composure. He couldn't let them see him crack. The officer, still standing at the window, wasn't satisfied with the answer. He leaned in closer, the smell of cheap aftershave filling the car, and repeated the question. "Are you sure?" Because we've been getting reports of some suspicious activity around here. And you don't exactly seem like the kind of people who belong. The word stung, not just because of the officer's blatant racial profiling, but because of how effortlessly he had dropped them, as though it was a normal part of their daily routine. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, his pulse quickening. It was as if the officer had just made up his mind about who Marcus was, based solely on his appearance. The color of his skin and nothing else. "We belong just as much as anyone else," Marcus replied, his voice calm but edged with tension. He could feel Naomi's eyes on him, but he didn't dare look at her just yet. He couldn't let his anger show, not with the kids in the back seat. "I'm just trying to get my family to our destination without any trouble. There's no need for this." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he looked over at his partner again, as though silently debating whether to press further. The second officer, still standing with his arms crossed, now moved toward the back of the car, clearly searching for something. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, made Marcus's nerves spike. It felt like they were waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. The tension was so thick now that it seemed to press in on all sides. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady, but he could feel the situation spiraling out of his control. "Look, I'm a federal agent," he said, his words deliberate, hoping to diffuse the situation. "I'm with the FBI. I'm just on vacation with my family, and this is a misunderstanding. I'm telling you the truth." The first officer, who had been eyeing Marcus closely, scoffed. "FBI, huh? Sure you are. You look like a tourist to me." There was mockery in his voice, and Marcus could tell that the officer didn't believe him. It was clear that his identity meant nothing to this man, that the idea of a black FBI agent didn't fit the officer's narrow worldview. "I'm not bluffing," Marcus said, his voice tightening. He could feel the anger in him now, simmering just beneath the surface. Naomi reached out and placed her hand on his, a silent plea for him to stay calm, but it was getting harder to keep the anger in check. The officer took a step back, his eyes narrowed with disbelief. "Well, you're gonna have to prove that to me. Get out of the car." It was the moment Marcus had feared. The situation had escalated far beyond what it should have been, and now he was being asked to get out of the car, as though he were a suspect in a crime. Naomi gasped, and the children, sensing the shift in the mood, became even more silent. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew what he had to do. "I'm not getting out of the car until you call your supervisor," he said firmly, his mind racing with the realization that this was no longer just a traffic stop. The officer hesitated for a moment, his hand lingering on his holster before turning to his partner. "Get the supervisor down here, now!" As the officer stepped away, Marcus let out a long breath. This wasn't over yet, and he knew that things were about to get even more complicated. The air in the car was thick with unease, the quiet broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the faint hum of passing cars on the road. Marcus could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, but he did his best to keep his composure. Naomi sat beside him, her fingers tightly gripping her seatbelt as she looked out of the window, trying not to show how much the situation was affecting her. The children were unusually quiet in the back seat, no longer the carefree little ones they had been just moments ago. Their innocent faces were now etched with confusion and fear. Marcus couldn't blame them. He could barely keep his own mind calm. The officer had walked away to make the call to his supervisor, leaving Marcus to sit in the suffocating silence of the moment. The ticking of the clock inside the car seemed louder now, as if every second stretched on forever. Marcus was no stranger to tense situations. He had been in countless high-stakes confrontations in his line of work, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal in front of him. This wasn't someone he could interrogate or confront with the calm professionalism he was trained to embody. No, this was something far more insidious. This was racial prejudice laid bare, something he couldn't escape, something he had no control over, something that made even his calm demeanor seem like a threat in the eyes of these officers. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his hand still gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He had already told them the truth about who he was, but the officer had dismissed him with a sneer. He knew he couldn't keep playing the "I'm an FBI agent" card forever. The officers had already made their minds up. It didn't matter what his badge said. It didn't matter who he was. All that mattered in that moment was that he was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naomi let out a soft sigh beside him, the weight of the situation starting to get to her as well. Marcus could feel the pressure building in the car. She had always been the stronger one between them, the rock that kept their family together through tough times, but he knew that even she was struggling to stay calm. "Marcus, what do we do now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would make everything worse. He turned his head to look at her, meeting her eyes for the first time since the situation had started. Her face was pale, the worry lines deepening around her eyes. She had always been his source of strength, but now she needed him to be the strong one. "We just wait," he said, his voice calm, though his insides were in turmoil. "We wait for the supervisor to get here. They'll figure out that we're not the problem here." Naomi nodded but didn't speak again. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his throat, every beat a reminder of how fragile this situation was. The longer they were stuck here, the more likely it was that things would escalate. He had no doubt that these officers would find a way to justify what they were doing, to find some excuse for their behavior. They wouldn't just let this go. They couldn't. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. This was about their pride, about their ability to control the situation, to assert their authority over someone they saw as an outsider. The sound of footsteps approached, and Marcus straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly. The officer who had originally stopped them reappeared, his face less smug than before, but still wearing an air of superiority. Behind him was another figure, one Marcus instantly recognized, the supervisor. The supervisor was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a hard expression. He wore his badge with a sense of authority, his uniform pressed and pristine. The moment he stepped into the scene, Marcus knew the situation had shifted. The supervisor looked at Marcus with a quick scan before turning his attention to the officers standing by the car. His eyes flicked between them, taking in the scene with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in law enforcement for years. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, his voice rough but controlled as he addressed the officer who had been speaking to Marcus. The officer hesitated before responding. "We pulled them over for a routine check," the officer began, but his words faltered under the supervisor's stern gaze. "But there's something off about this guy. He's being difficult, acting like he doesn't belong here. I've asked for his ID and—" "Difficult?" the supervisor interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You've been questioning him for what, 10 minutes? And you haven't even asked for his credentials yet?" The officer shifted uneasily, his face reddening. The supervisor turned his attention back to Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. I'm Officer Harris, the supervisor here. I'm going to ask you to step out of the vehicle so we can clear this up." Marcus stared at the man for a moment, the anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. He had been expecting this, the inevitable moment when he would have to prove himself, when he would have to give up his rights to make the officers feel better about their mistake. He knew they wouldn't simply apologize, wouldn't admit they're wrong. But he had to go along with it for now. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further. "I'm not getting out of the car," Marcus said firmly, his voice steady. "Not until you call my superior. I'm an FBI agent, and I've already told you that." The supervisor's eyes flicked over to the officers, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flash of something like uncertainty pass over his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Fine," the supervisor said curtly, though there was a hint of annoyance in his tone. "We'll check your credentials, but I need you to step out of the car so we can clear things up." Marcus hesitated, his hand gripping the door handle, but something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let them treat him like this any longer. "Call my supervisor first," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "You don't get to make demands of me until you do." For a moment, no one moved. The silence between them felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Naomi's hand reached out again, but this time Marcus didn't take it. He knew what he had to do. He had to stand his ground, even if it meant pushing the officers to their breaking point. He wasn't just a man on vacation. He wasn't just some black man on the side of the road. He was an FBI agent, and he wasn't going to let them forget that. The supervisor's face was unreadable, his eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus's refusal. The tension between them grew, thickening with each passing moment. Marcus kept his gaze steady, unwavering. knowing that this was the moment when he would either make them realize the truth or risk pushing the situation to the point of no return. Naomi's hand rested on his arm again, her touch light but grounding, as if silently telling him to stay calm. The children were still silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them as they huddled together in the back seat, their wide eyes watching the unfolding scene with confusion and fear. The supervisor turned slightly, his body language shifting as he motioned for one of the officers to make the call. The officer who had originally approached Marcus grabbed his radio, his fingers hovering over the buttons as he hesitated. The situation was escalating fast, and the longer it dragged on, the less likely it was that any resolution would come without further complications. Marcus could feel the pressure building in his chest, his heart beating faster as he waited for something to break the silence. "Call it in," the supervisor ordered sharply, his voice low but firm. The officer hesitated again before finally speaking into the radio. Marcus didn't catch all of the words, but he heard enough. He knew that the officer was verifying his identity, looking for any confirmation that Marcus was who he claimed to be. Marcus had hoped that his position would be enough to diffuse the tension, but it was clear now that the officers weren't convinced. It was as though they couldn't process the idea that a black man could be an FBI agent, that someone like Marcus could possibly have a career beyond the narrow confines of the small town's prejudices. The officer turned back to the supervisor after a moment, the radio crackling with static as he relayed the message. "FBI Agent Johnson, sir. He says he's with the federal government." The supervisor's lips curled into a thin, almost mocking smile. "Is that so?" he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. He turned his attention to Marcus, studying him once more, as if trying to decide whether to believe the officer or not. The skepticism in his eyes was unmistakable, and it made Marcus's blood boil. The supervisor clearly didn't trust him, and the idea of a black man holding such a position seemed like a bridge too far for him to cross. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the supervisor, his jaw tight but his posture firm. He wasn't going to back down now. He had already given them the benefit of the doubt, had already tried to be patient, but it was becoming clear that they weren't going to stop until they had broken him, until they had forced him to prove something he shouldn't have to prove in the first place. Naomi's voice, calm but filled with an edge of frustration, cut through the silence. "Why are you doing this to us?" she asked, her question simple but charged with all the confusion and anger she had been holding back. "We're just trying to get to our cabin. We've told you who we are. What more do you want from us?" The supervisor didn't answer immediately. He took another step toward the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he looked down at Naomi. There was a moment of stillness between them, a quiet understanding that whatever had been happening here had crossed a line, but the supervisor wasn't ready to acknowledge that yet. Instead, he focused on Marcus, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," the supervisor said, his voice flat and devoid of empathy. "We need to be sure about who's coming through our town. If you're really an FBI agent, then you shouldn't have a problem proving it." "I've already told you who I am," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I'm not going to prove anything else. You've already crossed a line by questioning us like this, and you're wasting our time." The supervisor seemed to weigh his options for a moment, the air thick with tension. Finally, he motioned to the officer with the radio. "Get the confirmation. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus could see the frustration building in the officer's face as he spoke again into the radio. The longer this dragged on, the more obvious it became that the supervisor was stalling, that he was looking for a way to save face, a way to maintain his authority in front of his subordinates. It wasn't about Marcus anymore. It was about pride, about proving that he had control over the situation no matter how wrong he was. "Do you think we're lying?" Naomi's voice broke through the charged silence again. "What do you want from us? We're not criminals. We just want to go on vacation to get away from everything." The supervisor's face twisted slightly, the muscles around his jaw tightening. "Ma'am, you're free to go once everything checks out. But right now this situation is under investigation and I'm doing my job to ensure everything is in order." "Investigation?" Naomi scoffed, her voice growing sharper. "You've been holding us here for over an hour for what? Because you don't like the way we look? Because you think we don't belong here? This isn't an investigation. It's harassment. The supervisor's eyes flicked to Naomi, his expression briefly flickering with annoyance. "I told you I'm doing my job," he repeated, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. It was clear that the walls he had built to justify his actions were starting to crack. He wasn't ready to admit it, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Your job?" Naomi echoed, disbelief evident in her tone. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to make us feel like criminals for no reason. You're supposed to enforce the law, not break it." The supervisor stiffened at the words, his eyes narrowing as he turned to his officer. "Call it in again," he ordered, his voice low, the frustration creeping in. The officer did as instructed, this time speaking into the radio with more urgency. Marcus could see the cracks in the supervisor's authority widening with every passing second. The longer this dragged on, the more exposed the truth became. That this wasn't about a simple mistake, about miscommunication or a routine check. This was about racism. This was about a system that had already decided who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. The officer who had originally stopped Marcus stood by, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with a guarded expression. His partner, the second officer, still said nothing, but there was a shift in his posture, a slight tension in his shoulders that suggested even he was beginning to realize the situation had gone too far. The silence in the air grew heavy, and Marcus could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny pressing down on him. It was clear they were trying to avoid facing the reality of their own mistakes, trying to salvage their pride at the expense of his dignity. "I'm not leaving until I speak to your superior," Marcus said again, his voice unwavering. The supervisor's eyes flared briefly, a mix of frustration and reluctant acknowledgement flickering in his gaze. "Fine, we'll call in your supervisor. But if you're lying to us, you'll regret it." Marcus's jaw clenched, his resolve strengthening. "You're the one who's going to regret this," he muttered under his breath, knowing that even if they didn't acknowledge it now, the truth would come out. They couldn't hold him forever, not when they had nothing to justify their actions. And the worst part of it all was that he knew this wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about a single wrongful arrest. This was about the way a system had been designed to keep people like him in their place, to make sure they knew their role in the eyes of those who thought they were above it all. As the radio crackled again, Marcus knew that this battle was far from over, but he was ready, and he wasn't going to back down. The silence that filled the car after Marcus's words was almost suffocating. The tension hung in the air, thicker than the humidity of the evening. Naomi, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, glanced nervously at Marcus before turning her gaze toward the officers. Their eyes, filled with suspicion and thinly veiled contempt, had never left them, not for a moment. The radio crackled again, the only sound breaking the stillness as the officer who had first approached them spoke into the device. It wasn't the confirmation that Marcus was hoping for, nor the relief of hearing his identity verified. Instead, it was another request for further confirmation, a phrase that Marcus knew would only delay the inevitable even further. Naomi leaned closer to Marcus, her voice low but filled with the urgency she couldn't hide. "Marcus, what if they don't believe you? What if they never let us go?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was profound. It was the fear of being stuck, of being trapped in a system that refused to see them as anything other than what the officers assumed they were. For a brief moment, Marcus could feel the fear creeping up his own spine, a fear he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. He wasn't just afraid for himself, he was afraid for Naomi, for their children, and for the countless others who found themselves in the same position, who were wrongly accused, harassed, and even brutalized simply because of the color of their skin. But Marcus refused to let that fear consume him. He wouldn't let it define this moment. "We're not leaving without them acknowledging the truth," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "You hear me, Naomi? This isn't just about us. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. We have to make them see who we really are, not who they want to think we are." Naomi nodded, though her eyes betrayed her lingering fear. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they would somehow walk away from this, their dignity intact. But it was hard. It was hard because she knew how these situations went, how often the system turned its back on people like them, how often the color of their skin was enough to turn them into suspects in the eyes of the law, no matter their station or the truth of their identity. The officer with the radio continued to speak, his words becoming less and less clear as Marcus tuned them out. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, processing, trying to figure out the best way to handle this moment. He had seen situations like this before, had worked in places where the law was more of a suggestion than an institution, where racial profiling was so ingrained that it became second nature for officers to assume guilt before innocence. But this time it wasn't just about fighting injustice from the outside. It was about surviving it. It was about ensuring that his family didn't leave this town broken. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally turned away from the radio, a grim look on his face. The supervisor didn't say a word, but instead crossed his arms and stood still like a statue. He was waiting for something, waiting for Marcus to back down, to admit that he was wrong, to apologize for the disruption he was causing. But Marcus wouldn't do it. He wouldn't let the supervisor or anyone make him feel small. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The officer who had been speaking into the radio returned to the car, his steps slow, deliberate. He stood in front of the driver's side window, his eyes locked on Marcus. "We've called in the verification," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "It'll take some time, but you need to step out of the vehicle while we wait for further instructions." Marcus's chest tightened, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when they would demand even more of him. They had already dragged this on for far too long. The supervisor's cold, dismissive gaze told Marcus everything he needed to know. The officers were determined to make this process as difficult as possible, to assert their authority, even if it meant humiliating an innocent man in front of his family. "I'm not stepping out of the car until you've confirmed who I am," Marcus replied, his voice low but unwavering. He could feel Naomi's breath catch beside him, and he knew that she was holding her own breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the air grew even heavier as the officer shifted on his feet, clearly not prepared for this level of resistance. "We're just doing our job, okay?" the officer said, the tone in his voice shifting slightly, trying to soften his previous hard edge. "We've got to make sure everything checks out." Marcus's eyes never wavered from the officer's face. "You've made me wait long enough. I've told you who I am, and now you're wasting my time." The supervisor finally moved, stepping forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His expression was no longer the cold mask of authority. It had shifted, his features now strained, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and something else, something deeper. "Enough," the supervisor said, his voice rising just enough to make it clear that he wasn't about to back down. "We'll figure this out, but you're not going to call the shots here. Get out of the car now." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Marcus could feel the heat of the supervisor's gaze, the pressure mounting with each passing second. He had a choice to make. He could fight back, push further, or he could comply, at least temporarily, to get them to finally acknowledge his identity. The frustration that had been building inside him surged to the surface, but he didn't let it show. He had to stay in control. He had to stay calm for Naomi, for the children, and for himself. Marcus exhaled slowly, his decision made. He opened the door, stepping out of the car with deliberate slowness. The movement felt like a surrender, but it wasn't. It was calculated. It was strategic. He was playing the game, but on his terms, not theirs. As he stood outside the car, the night air hit him like a slap, but it only sharpened his senses. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders, but he refused to let it crush him. Naomi opened the car door, following him out. She didn't speak, but her presence beside him was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that they were in this together. The children remained in the back seat, silent and scared, but Marcus knew they were watching. They were watching him stand tall, even when everything around him was crumbling. The supervisor and the officer stood a few feet away, watching Marcus with wariness in their eyes. They had expected a different reaction, perhaps a sign of fear or submission, but they wouldn't get that from him. Not tonight. The radio crackled again, but this time the words that came through were different. The officer who had called it in spoke quickly, his voice filled with urgency. "We've confirmed it. He's who he says he is. He's an FBI agent." The supervisor's face twitched, and for a brief moment Marcus saw a flicker of something like shame cross his face. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You're free to go," the supervisor muttered, his voice less authoritative now, more resigned. "But don't make a scene. Just leave." Naomi's breath caught in her throat, and Marcus could feel the relief flood through him, though it was tainted with anger. It was over. For them, at least. But they both knew that this wasn't over for everyone. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the system that had been allowed to perpetuate this kind of injustice without accountability. Marcus nodded, his eyes still locked on the supervisor. "We're leaving," he said quietly but firmly. "And you'll remember this." Naomi quickly ushered the children out of the car, her hands trembling slightly as she held them close. Marcus followed, keeping his eyes on the officers until they got back into the car and drove away, their minds no doubt still processing the situation. But Marcus knew that this moment, this injustice, wouldn't be forgotten. It couldn't be. As Marcus drove away from the scene, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of the encounter hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder of the injustice they had just endured. Naomi sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm as if she were trying to reassure herself as much as him. In the back seat, the children were silent. The only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of Tasha's small movements. It had been a quiet drive up until now, the landscape passing by with nothing but the rhythmic motion of the tires on the road. But now the silence in the car felt oppressive. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? Marcus's mind was still racing. The encounter had left him shaken, not by the officer's actions. He had seen enough in his line of work to know what kind of people existed in the world, but by the realization that, even with his identity confirmed, the officer had treated him like a criminal simply because of his appearance. The feeling that gripped his chest now wasn't anger, though there was plenty of that to go around. It was a deep sense of disillusionment, an overwhelming sadness for what had happened to them, for what had happened to so many others. His thoughts drifted to all the people who hadn't had the means to stand up, who hadn't had the training or the privilege to challenge the system. How many had been forced into submission, told to comply even when they knew they were right. He had fought the system for years, but this was different. This wasn't just about doing his job. It was about the very core of who he was and who they were as a family. Naomi's voice broke the silence, soft but tinged with a layer of sadness that made Marcus's heart ache. "Are we safe now?" The question was simple, but its weight was impossible to ignore. In that moment, Marcus knew she wasn't just asking about their immediate physical safety. She was asking about the world they lived in, about whether it was truly safe for their children to grow up in this environment, where their very presence could lead to suspicion, hostility, and fear. Naomi had always been strong, a pillar of support in their family, but even she couldn't hide the crack in her voice, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to suppress. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing briefly at her before returning his gaze to the road. He didn't want to say the wrong thing, didn't want to give her false hope or make her feel like the world was a safe place when it wasn't. "We're safe for now," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "But that doesn't mean everything is okay. We've seen what can happen when the system gets it wrong. We've seen how fast things can escalate." Naomi nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his arm as if she were trying to hold on to something solid. She wasn't afraid of the road ahead. It was the world she was afraid of. A world where people who looked like them were treated as suspects simply for existing. Marcus could hear her thoughts without her saying another word. The doubt, the fear of the unknown. But there was something else there too. A spark of resilience that he recognized. The same resilience that had drawn him to her when they first met. The same determination that had kept them strong through every hardship. The weight of the moment still lingered. But Marcus tried to focus on the road ahead, trying to push aside the anger that was still bubbling under the surface. He needed to focus. They still had a long way to go, and despite the emotional toll this had taken, they couldn't afford to let it consume them completely. The road to Pine Hollow was still ahead, and they were still determined to get there, to find some semblance of peace, even if only for a few days. The drive felt longer now, each mile stretching out as if the world had somehow become bigger, more uncertain. Marcus's mind wandered back to the encounter with the officers, to the way they had treated him, to the way they had dismissed him without hesitation, without thought. It wasn't just about the way they had viewed him. It was about the way they had treated his family, his children, who had done nothing but sit quietly in the back of the car. Naomi had been right to ask if they were safe. What did safety even mean anymore? It wasn't just about being out of immediate danger. It was about the constant threat of something happening again. The constant fear that no matter how many steps they took forward, they would always be vulnerable to something they couldn't control. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Tasha's voice from the back seat. "Daddy, are we there yet?" The innocence of the question made Marcus's heart ache. She didn't understand what had just happened. Didn't know that the world could be so cruel, so unforgiving. She just wanted to get to their cabin, to have fun, to forget about everything that had happened before. She wanted to live in a world where their only concern was playing in the woods or roasting marshmallows by the fire, and Marcus wanted that for her more than anything. But the world wasn't that simple, and they couldn't ignore the reality that was waiting for them when they arrived. "We're almost there, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his voice softer now. He turned his head to look at her briefly in the rearview mirror, offering her a small smile. He wasn't sure if it reached his eyes, but he needed to give her something, anything to hold on to. The weight of the moment felt so much heavier when he thought about how young she was, how much innocence she had yet to lose. The cabin was still some distance away, but it loomed in Marcus's mind like a distant hope, a place where they could be safe, where they could forget for a moment that the world was still filled with so much hate, so much fear. They had planned this vacation for months, hoping it would be the escape they so desperately needed. They hadn't expected it to come with such a painful reminder of everything they were up against. But Marcus wasn't about to let it defeat them. He couldn't. He had to be strong for Naomi, for the children. He had to make them believe that no matter what had happened, they could still find peace. They could still find a way to move forward. The car hummed along the road, and as they neared their destination, Marcus's heart began to settle, the immediate rush of adrenaline fading slightly. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in what felt like hours, he could breathe just a little easier. The cabin was close, and with it the promise of rest. They would be okay for now. They would find a way to heal, to put this behind them, even if only for a few days. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the air seemed different, fresher, cleaner, the scent of pine trees filling their lungs as they stepped out of the car. It wasn't much, just a simple cabin nestled in the woods far from the chaos they had left behind. The children ran ahead, eager to explore their new surroundings, their laughter cutting through the stillness of the forest. Naomi and Marcus exchanged a glance, and for a moment everything seemed right. The world outside could wait. Here, in this small corner of the world, they could forget. Here, they could just be a family. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the tranquility of the moment wash over him. The battle was far from over, and he knew that. But for now, they had found something that was theirs. A small piece of peace in a world that often seemed determined to take it away, and that at least was enough. The next morning, the world seemed different. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the cabin's porch as Marcus stepped outside, taking in the fresh mountain air. It was crisp, the kind of air that felt like a deep, cleansing breath after a long, suffocating struggle. He stood there for a moment, his eyes closed, savoring the peace that surrounded him. It was hard to imagine that just 24 hours ago, his family had been sitting in that car, held captive by the officer's unspoken prejudices. The weight of that moment hadn't disappeared, but here, in the quiet of the woods, Marcus could almost forget. For a brief time, he could pretend that the world was a fairer place, that his children could grow up without fear, without having to face the same kind of injustice he had witnessed all his life. But reality wasn't that simple, and Marcus knew that better than anyone. His thoughts drifted back to the incident, to the cold stares of the officers, the way they treated him like a criminal without a second thought. He could still hear the supervisor's dismissive voice, the way he tried to cover his own discomfort with arrogance. Marcus had held his ground, but what about the families who couldn't? What about the countless others who were wronged by the system every single day, and didn't have the means or the strength to stand up for themselves? The rustling of leaves behind him broke his train of thought, and he turned to see Naomi stepping out of the cabin with a mug in her hands, her expression more relaxed than he had seen it in days. The tension that had gripped her since the night before had loosened, though there was still an underlying unease in her eyes. She was trying to protect him, trying to protect their family, but Marcus knew the toll it had taken on her. She had always been strong, but even the strongest could be worn down, especially when faced with something so unjust. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady. She offered him the mug, and he took it, letting the warmth seep into his hands. "Morning," he replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong just the way he liked it. Naomi sat down beside him, her legs tucked beneath her as she gazed out at the forest. The peacefulness of the moment wasn't lost on either of them, but it also felt fleeting, fragile. The world outside was still the same. The injustices were still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rear their ugly heads again at any moment. "I can't stop thinking about last night," Naomi said, breaking the silence between them. "About what they did to us, to you. I keep asking myself what would have happened if we hadn't been able to prove who you are. What if they'd just kept us there? What if they'd treated us worse?" Marcus set the mug down beside him, turning to face her. He had been avoiding these questions, trying not to confront the fear that had settled deep in his gut. But Naomi was right. He couldn't avoid it forever. He had been lucky. He had been able to use his position to prove who he was, to force them to acknowledge his identity. But that didn't change the fact that they had still been wrongfully detained. And what about the others? The people who didn't have the same connections, the same resources? How many times had they been treated the same way, without anyone to stand up for them? "It's a constant battle," he said quietly. "Not just with the people who wear badges like that, but with the system itself. It's designed to make us feel small, to make us doubt ourselves, to make us believe that we're not worthy of the same rights and respect as everyone else. But we can't let it win. We can't let it break us." Naomi nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I know, but it's hard. It's so hard, Marcus. I don't want our kids to grow up like this, always wondering if someone's going to treat them like criminals just because of the color of their skin. I don't want them to face what we faced." Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't want that either. And I won't let it happen if I can help it. But we can't fight this alone. We have to keep pushing, keep standing up for what's right. We have to make sure they know that we won't back down no matter what." The sound of the children's laughter drifted through the air, breaking the weight of the conversation. Tasha and Jamal were running around the small clearing in front of the cabin, their joy infectious as they played in the sunlight. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to watch them, to see their faces filled with nothing but happiness. They didn't know what had happened the night before. They didn't understand the gravity of the situation. But Marcus and Naomi did. They knew how precious these moments were, how fragile their innocence was in a world that was so quick to judge. "I want to believe things can get better," Naomi said after a long pause, her voice tinged with hope. "I want to believe that we can change things, that our kids won't have to grow up in fear." Marcus met her gaze, his expression softer now, though the weight of their conversation still hung heavy in the air. "We have to believe it, Naomi. If we don't, what are we fighting for? We can't give up on them. We can't give up on ourselves. We just have to keep going even when it feels like it's not enough." Naomi nodded slowly, her fingers still intertwined with his. "You're right. We can't give up, not now, not after everything we've been through." The sound of footsteps approaching brought their attention back to the present. Tasha and Jamal ran toward them, their faces bright with excitement. "Mom, Dad! We found a stream," Tasha exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder. "Can we go see it?" Jamal asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Marcus and Naomi exchanged a glance, and for the first time since the incident the night before, they both smiled. It was small, but it was enough. It was a moment of peace, a moment that reminded them why they kept fighting. For their children. For their family. For a future where things could be different. "We'll go see it," Marcus said, his voice warm with affection. "Let's go together." As they made their way toward the stream, Marcus felt a sense of calm wash over him, a fleeting but welcome relief from the storm of emotions that had clouded his mind since the night before. They weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead, more injustices to face, but in this moment they had found something precious. They had found their peace, their family, and a shared understanding that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they would face it together. The stream was small, but its water ran clear and cold, the sound of it flowing over rocks soothing and peaceful. Tasha and Jamal knelt by the water's edge, their laughter filling the air as they dipped their hands into the cool water, their faces lit up with the joy of discovery. Marcus and Naomi stood together watching their children, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, Marcus allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but they had taken the first step, and that was enough. As the day drew to a close, the sky above the cabin turned a soft shade of amber, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the forest floor. The Johnson family sat together around a campfire they had built earlier in the evening, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the otherwise still night. Marcus and Naomi sat side by side, their hands intertwined, the warmth of the fire reflecting the warmth in their hearts. The children, tired from their exploration earlier, had fallen asleep in the cozy cabin, their faces peaceful in their dreams. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to sit in the silence, to breathe without the weight of the world pressing down on him. It had been a long journey, one filled with pain and frustration, but it had also been a journey of resilience. They had faced the darkness of the world, confronted the prejudices and injustices that sought to tear them apart, but they had not allowed it to define them. No matter how many times the system tried to break them, no matter how many battles they fought and lost, they had fought together. And in this moment, as the fire crackled and the night air grew cool around them, Marcus felt a quiet strength settling in his chest. They had survived. They had found peace, even if it was fleeting. The stars above twinkled like diamonds in the vast expanse of the night sky, the universe stretching on endlessly. It was easy in that moment to forget about everything else. To forget about the hatred and the fear, to forget about the officers and the injustices. It was easy to let the peace of the night wrap around them like a blanket, to let it soothe their tired souls. But Marcus knew that peace, like everything else in life, was fragile. The world wouldn't change overnight. The fight would go on, and yet in the quiet of the forest, with Naomi by his side and his children safe inside, he allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. If they kept fighting, if they kept pushing back against the tide of injustice, they could create a world where their children would be free to live without fear. He glanced over at Naomi, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she gazed into the flames. She had always been his anchor, his strength when he felt like he couldn't go on. She had stood by him through everything, even when the world seemed to turn its back on them. He knew that they were strong enough to face whatever came next, that together they could overcome any challenge. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk side by side, with their children's future in their hearts. Marcus, Naomi's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but steady. We're going to keep fighting, right? He turned to her, his gaze steady and filled with conviction. Yes, Naomi, we'll keep fighting. For them, for us, for everyone who needs a voice. She smiled, the smile that had always been a source of comfort for him, a reminder of their shared purpose. I'm with you always. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. They had made it through the darkness, but the fight wasn't over. They would continue to face challenges, continue to face people who tried to break them down, but they would not be defeated. They would fight for justice, for equality, for the future of their children. They would not let the system win, not now, not ever. And as the fire burned low and the stars shone brightly above them, Marcus knew that this moment was just a small part of their journey. A journey that would take them far from this place, a journey that would be filled with both triumphs and setbacks. But whatever came, they would face it together, with strength, with love, and with an unwavering belief in what was right. The fight was just beginning, but for now, in this quiet corner of the world, they had found something that no injustice could take away. A moment of peace, a moment of hope. The end.